Vladimir Lenin, the communist leader and Marxist theorist synonymous with revolution, was more moderate than one might think. This may seem like a provocative statement. After all, for non-leftists, who could be more fanatical than the founding father of the Soviet Union? But if Lenin were alive today, I can easily imagine some self-declared anarchists and communists scoffing at some of his tactical theories as not being radical enough. For instance, there are leftists in contemporary times who believe organizing in electoral politics within a capitalist system is beneath them. Radicals like the famed writer Chris Hedges often like to quote the anarchist philosopher Emma Goldman, who stated, "If voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal." Others, like the libertarian socialist Zapatistas in Mexico, have maintained a strategy of abstaining from elections altogether. Vladimir Lenin, on the other hand, argued that electoral politics in a liberal democracy can be a useful vehicle in mobilizing the masses. As he wrote in 1920 in a critique of many leftists in Europe who wanted to boycott elections in their bourgeoisie nations, Lenin argued that participation in parliamentary elections and in the struggle on the parliamentary rostrum is obligatory on the party of the revolutionary proletariat, specifically for the purpose of educating the backward strata of its own class. He complained that those quote-unquote left-wing communists who thought that electoral politics was obsolete were at risk of turning into nothing but windbags. The Bolshevik leader was more moderate in this sense, in that he favored practicality over ideological purity. In another example of how he was less radical than some contemporary leftists, who scorn at building alliances with those holding liberal or conservative viewpoints, Lenin insisted that revolutionaries can still educate workers who are unfamiliar with the doctrine of Marxism. As he wrote in 1909, "When a workers' party grows very quickly, as ours did in 1905 and 6, its penetration by a mass of elements imbued with the petty bourgeoisie spirit is inevitable, and there's nothing bad about that. The historic task of the proletariat is to assimilate, reschool, re-educate all elements of the old society that the latter bequeaths it in the shape of offshoots of the petty bourgeoisie. But the proletariat must re-educate these newcomers and influence them, and not be influenced by them." However, Lenin was not in favor of making alliances with everyone. He was still adamantly against collaborating with opportunists, or what we might call political grifters. One of the relevant insights the leader of the Bolsheviks understood was that whenever left-wing ideas become popular with the public, socialists must contend with the simultaneous emergence of grifters who sneak into the ranks of the working class. From time immemorial, anytime the left is successful, it is quickly infiltrated by opportunists who have no genuine ideological commitment to the cause. Every popular movement has its frauds who wiggle in front of the march and pretend they have always been leading the charge. "Opportunism is our principal enemy," Lenin observed in 1920. "The whole thing boils down to nothing but bribery, by providing cooperative, trade union, parliamentary leaders with thousands of cushy jobs." He contended against what he called quote-unquote ministerial socialists, who betrayed the cause of socialism and sometimes collaborated or entered government with reactionary political actors. Similarly, Lenin's contemporary, the other great Marxist thinker of that era, Rosa Luxemburg, observed that self-seeking politicians often pretend to be on the left to get elected. As Luxemburg wrote, "Parliamentarianism is the breeding place of all opportunist tendencies. With the growth of the labor movement, parliamentarianism becomes a springboard for political careerists." For Lenin and Luxemburg, the political grifters they railed against were figures like the socialist Alexandre Millerand of France, who at the start of the 20th century took a ministerial role in a center-right coalition government. Lenin argued that figures like Millerand were settling for reforms over revolution and were bringing bourgeoisie ideas and bourgeoisie elements into socialism and would eventually sell out. His critique turned out to be prescient, as Millerand would later drift to the right wing and serve as the Minister of War during World War I. So how did Vladimir Lenin know that Millerand would betray the left? The Russian revolutionary had a formula for spotting political grifters. In his 1904 pamphlet, "One Step Forward, Two Steps Back," Lenin wrote that the characteristic feature of opportunists were its vagueness, amorphousness, elusiveness. He described what we would call quote-unquote grifters with the following words: "An opportunist, by his very nature, will always evade taking a clear and decisive stand. He will always seek a middle course. He will always wiggle like a snake between two mutually exclusive points of view and try to quote-unquote agree with both and reduce his differences of opinion to petty amendments, doubts, innocent and pious suggestions, and so on and so forth." In other words, ambiguity is a hint that a political actor may be a grifter in disguise. They are politicians who speak in platitudes and cliches, refusing to take any quote-unquote controversial stance, trying to please everyone without antagonizing anyone. Take, for example, Barack Obama, who should be considered the poster child of modern-day grifting. Obama was ostensibly a progressive back in the 2008 presidential election and ran to the left of Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary. He campaigned on his credentials as an early critic of the Iraq War, went after Clinton's support of free trade agreements like NAFTA that offshored American jobs, and he suggested that he would place a moratorium on foreclosures after the 2008 financial crash. But once in office, Obama bombed 7 Middle Eastern countries, spearheaded an even more disastrous free trade agreement with the Trans-Pacific Partnership that labor unions called NAFTA on steroids, and he not only did not put a halt on foreclosures, but he even refused to prosecute a single Wall Street executive who was responsible for the 2008 financial meltdown. 10 million Americans were evicted because Obama did nothing. But were there hints that Obama would have been a grifter? According to Lenin's characterizations of opportunists being deliberately vague in their language, the answer is yes. Obama's 2008 campaign slogans were hope, change, as well as yes we can. But hope for what? What kind of change? What did he mean by yes we can? It was never specified because the campaign depended upon strategic ambiguity. It allowed Obama to cast a wide net over the electorate who could make false interpretations of what hope, change, and yes we can meant. In addition to vagueness and elusiveness, another sign of opportunism that Lenin recognized was the aversion of internationalism and the embrace of imperialism. Political grifters can often appear left-wing on domestic issues, but when it came time to war, they were more than willing to shift to the right and betray the working class, as Lenin wrote in 1916. Opportunists are a section of the petty bourgeoisie and of a certain strata of the working class who have been bribed out of imperialist super profits and converted to watchdogs of capitalism and corruptors of the labor movement. At the time Lenin wrote this, he was attacking the so-called socialists and other European nations who had gone along to support World War I. Before the war, international solidarity was a key principle of the left, with the belief that the working class should not be pitted against each other to fight and die for the interests of the capitalist elites. But once the Great War broke out, the socialist leaders in countries like France and Germany ended up betraying their internationalist principles. They went along with jingoistic fervor to support the war. As Rosa Luxemburg sarcastically jabbed, the Marxist slogan went from "Workers of the world unite" to "Unite in peacetime and cut each other's throats in war." Unlike other socialist sellouts in France and Germany, Lenin remained principled and believed that the working class movement will remain true to itself only if it joins neither one nor the other imperialist bourgeoisie, only if it says that two sides are equally bad, and if it wishes the defeat of the imperialist bourgeoisie in every country. Lenin understood that the Great War was about the bourgeoisie waging the war to divide and exploit the world and oppress other nations. He viewed the supposed leftists who supported the war as nothing but opportunists, settling for a few crumbs of the bourgeoisie's huge profits. It has long been true throughout American political history that war often exposes the true colors of those seemingly on the left. During the early 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt, who had championed progressive taxation and an 8-hour workday, advocated for U.S. entry into World War I and called for the arrest of anti-war activists. In the 1960s, the leadership of major trade unions like the AFL-CIO, as well as prominent civil rights leaders like Bayard Rustin, cheered for the Vietnam War. In the 2000s, one of the most famous left-wing essayists at the time, the Trotskyite Christopher Hitchens, would go on to become a neoconservative and back the invasion of Iraq. Then there is, of course, the Palestine question. There have been plenty of left-wing politicians who are progressive on virtually every domestic issue but are not willing to go far enough to express international solidarity with the plight of the Palestinians. While the Gaza genocide has been so horrific that it has become too politically toxic for many left-wing politicians to support Israel, That wasn't the case back when Palestine was considered a fringe issue. As late as 2019, for instance, even some of the most left-leaning members of Congress, like Representative Ro Khanna and Representative Ayanna Pressley, voted in favor of a resolution condemning the movement to boycott Israel. While Khanna and Pressley are now critics of Israel, the question remains whether or not they genuinely care about Palestinian lives, or if they just flip-flop for their own personal political aspirations now that Gaza is no longer a fringe issue for the American electorate. Additionally, with the growing unpopularity with Israel, we have also recently witnessed Democratic politicians lying about receiving donations from AIPAC. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, for example, said that he received only $10,000 from AIPAC's PAC in this election cycle. But FEC records show that AIPAC had actually given Jeffries more than $1 million in earmarked donations. Other examples include Nebraska congressional candidate Democrat Denise Powell, who had denied taking money from AIPAC while dark money pro-Israel PACs have been supporting her campaign. Perhaps the most bizarre case is Pennsylvania congressional candidate Alice Stanford, who was caught lying about taking $500,000 in AIPAC donations and panicked by dropping out of primary debates and blocking public comments on their social media accounts. As Lenin would have realized, these are signs of opportunism, wiggling like a snake between two mutually exclusive points by pretending not to be pro-Israel to the electorate while pandering to AIPAC. It was true then during Lenin's era, and it is true now, that the left must stay vigilant against opportunists who seek to infiltrate the ranks of the working class movement. Yet, we still see today with leftists being hoodwinked by the most obvious political grifters. Take, for instance, Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman. When he ran for his seat just a few years ago in 2022, he championed progressive policies like Medicare for all. Before that, during the 2016 presidential primary, he endorsed the Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders. Yet, as soon as he entered the Senate, Fetterman has proved to be a right-wing Democrat. He has become one of the most vocal Zionists in Congress during the Gaza genocide, as well as being the only senator from his party to fund the Homeland Security Department and Trump's deportation machine. Left-wing YouTubers like Crystal Ball, Ben Burgess, and Sam Cedar, who had praised Fetterman back in 2022, were deceived. But Lenin would have known that Fetterman's long history of being pro-Israel, along with his aversion to international solidarity, was a red flag and a sign that he would betray the left. Other examples of modern left-wing grifters include Tulsi Gabbard. Now serving as the Director of National Intelligence under Trump, it is easy to forget that Gabbard was once one of the most left-wing members of Congress, being one of only 3 members of the House to vote against a fiscally conservative budget rule known as PAYGO back in 2019. During the 2016 presidential election, Gabbard famously resigned from her position in the Democratic National Committee to endorse Bernie Sanders. Yet, she quickly jumped to the Republican Party as soon as it became evident that Trump could enter the White House again just before the 2024 presidential election. Leftist influencers like Kyle Kalinske, Max Blumenthal, and Jimmy Dore, who used to be fans of Gabbard, were fooled. But again, Lenin would have realized that Gabbard always had characteristics of an opportunist, as her progressive credentials were vague and her commitment to left-wing policies like Medicare for all was ambiguous. Then there is the most recent example of an obvious grifter who is sure to follow the same right-wing path as John Fetterman and Tulsi Gabbard. Graham Plattner, the supposed left-wing populist running in the Maine Senate election. There have been a lot of excitement over Plattner. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have endorsed him. Left-wing media outlets like Jacobin, More Perfect Union, Majority Report, Breaking Points, and Young Turks have been gushing over Plattner. It is baffling that those with political education are falling for another fraud and have not learned their lesson from Fetterman and Gabbard. It is not just that Plattner has had a tattoo on his chest that he claimed not to know was a fascist symbol, when an old friend of his had said that Plattner had always known what it meant. Plattner has victim-blamed women who were essayed, writing in a Reddit post dating back in 2013, "If you're so worried about it to buy Kevlar underwear, you think you might not get blacked out up around people you aren't comfortable with," as well as writing that victims of SA should take some responsibility for themselves and not get so up that they wind up having sex with someone they don't mean to. And not only did Plattner serve multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, but as late as 2018, he also worked for the Blackwater private military firm that has been responsible for war crimes. He said he enlisted because he wanted to have an adventure and kill some people. He even defended urinating on the bodies of dead soldiers. Once again, Lenin would have viewed Graham Plattner as nothing but a careerist, even if he appears left-wing on domestic issues, so long as there's an aversion to internationalism and an embrace of imperialism. Grifters like Plattner would backstab the working class in a heartbeat. This is precisely why more left-wingers need to read Vladimir Lenin, who is more relevant than ever. This midterm election cycle is filled with what we can consider ministerial socialist politicians, who pretend to be on the left during campaign season, but will quickly shift to the right once in office. It is an unfortunate state of affairs that socialists and progressives today in the United States are not at all cautious of political grifters. While fascists and the right wing remain our biggest foes, it may end up being opportunists who have infiltrated our ranks that will discredit and destroy our movement.